Welcome. This is Najma Minhas with GBS Dialogue. Unprecedented attack by Hamas yesterday on Israel left over 600 Israelis dead, 400 Palestinians dead, thousands have been wounded on both sides. Israelis have been left stunned and shocked. Western nations have come out and condemned the actions and given Israel the right to self-defense. This is still one issue, however, over which Muslim nations disagree. Whilst generally condemning Hamas, many Muslim nations have said this reinforces the need for peace between the Palestinians and Israelis, and talk of two-state solution once again should be started. I'm joined today by Mr. Sami Hamdi, who is a public commentator on MENA issues and an MD for international organization. Hi, Sami. Thank you so much for joining me today. Sami, tell me, is it right to say that what Hamas has done is unprecedented?
Thank you very much, Najma, for having me. I think for all intents and purposes, and even the Israelis are saying it is unprecedented, and it's unprecedented for a number of reasons. The first is that for the first time since 1948, the Palestinians have actually been able to retake, even if it's just temporarily, they've been able to retake land and settlements that have been seized by the Israelis in the past. They managed to take the settlements that are surrounding the Gaza Strip, and that's something that was not even achieved in 1973. For context, in 1973, when the Egyptians and the Syrians broke the Israeli lines, they broke the Israeli lines in the Sinai Peninsula and in the Golan Heights, which were not considered Israel proper. This time, for the first time, the Palestinians have broken through the Israeli lines in Israel proper. And that's why we saw the reaction of Netanyahu was that to declare war, official state of war, the first time Israel has done so since 1973, since that 6-day war, since Yom Kippur. So it's unprecedented in that regard. The second reason that it's unprecedented is also the amount of hostages that the Hamas and the Palestinian forces have been able to take. To put that into context, in the 2010s, the Palestinians were able to trade 1,500 Palestinian prisoners for one Israeli soldier. In other words, the number of hostages that the Palestinians have taken suddenly give the Palestinians huge leverage in terms of trying to release those who have been arbitrarily imprisoned by the Israelis. And the third point why it's unprecedented is because previously in 1948 and in 1973, we were talking about regional powers going to war against Israel. But this is uniquely Palestinian forces. This is about the Palestinians having developed their capabilities to such an extent that they were able to bypass Israel, which has one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks. They were able to bypass that and advance so deep into Israel that the Israelis were in such shock that they had no idea how to respond in the first 24 hours, and they weren't sure how to respond either. It's also worth noting as well that the Iron Dome has been penetrated now for the third time. Initially, it was considered to be a blip or a technical blip, but now the Palestinian militants or Palestinian factions or the Palestinian groups, call them what you will, have been able to bypass that Iron Dome, which is a state-of-the-art technology designed to protect Israel. The fact that it's been breached means that it no longer serves its purpose in terms of providing cover for those Israeli territories, meaning that Netanyahu now is under unprecedented pressure to actually do something about it. So when we say that it is unprecedented, it is quite frankly unprecedented. And I think the reason why everybody's talking about it is because they are shocked that this was not done by nation states. This was done by the very Palestinians that everybody thought were a dying breed and that their cause was dying.
Now, you mentioned the Iron Door that was breached. One of the major questions that everyone's asking is, where were all the intelligence agencies? We've talked about Mossad being the best intelligence agencies or among the best in the world. Where was Mossad? Where was Five Eyes? We heard a lot about Five Eyes recently because of the allegations that the Indian government may have murdered a Sikh separatist in Canada. And we heard about the intelligence that the Five Eyes share with each other. Where were all these intelligence agencies? How was Hamas able to organize an attack in this way?
I think that, to put it quite bluntly, this question is easier answered if we put ourselves in the position of the Israelis. The reality is that Netanyahu has been receiving a lot of overtures, a lot of delegations from the likes of Erdogan of Turkey, from Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, from Mohammed bin Zayed, from the Moroccans, When Netanyahu was sitting with Erdogan, and Erdogan is telling him, we want warmer ties, we want to build a gas pipeline together, we want to build a new economic corridor, please don't go to the Saudis, build the economic corridor through me, don't do it India, Saudi, UAE, do it through Turkey, Iraq, and elsewhere. Netanyahu was convinced that somebody like Erdogan, who for many years was considered to be the bastion or the main advocate of the Palestinian cause, that Erdogan was moving away from that cause. When the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, according to the Reuters exclusive, is telling the Americans that he's not interested in the Palestinian state as much as he's interested in a NATO-style security pact with the US, and that if Biden gives it to him, he's willing to let go of the Palestinians. And when the UAE ambassador to Washington, Yusuf Al-Utaiba, tells a think tank a couple of months ago that the Palestine issue is no longer relevant for us. We tried to talk to the Israelis, but now it's up to the states that have normalized. But let me tell you how amazing it is now that we've normalized. Netanyahu believed that as a result of the Muslim states turning away and compromising the Palestinian cause for personal gain, then essentially Hamas and the Palestinian factions would no longer have the international support that they require in order to be able to mount an offensive. And that led to a complacency in the ranks of the intelligence and the ranks of the military. The idea being that when bin Salman received the delegation of the Palestinian Authority and then sent his so-called ambassador to Ramallah to meet the Palestinian Authority, the Israelis believed that the engagement of the Palestinian Authority with the Saudis, knowing full well that bin Salman is planning to sell them out for the NATO-style agreement, suggests that the Palestinians are so powerless that they cannot even rebuke Saudi Arabia. Therefore, for Mossad and for the Israeli intelligence services, the Palestinians did not pose a threat. On the contrary, if you remember Netanyahu a few days ago, he was waving the map in the UN of his ideal version of the Middle East. And in that map, there's no mention of Palestine. Israel essentially encompasses all the territories, including the Palestinian territories. And in the same breath, Netanyahu was saying that we are very close to normalization with Saudi Arabia. And the Israeli ambassador to the UN told Can Television, the Israeli channel, when he was asked, will Netanyahu's government sign off on normalization with Israel, or normalization with Saudi Arabia, he replied that normalization means the abandoning of the Palestinians, and when the government realizes that, they will sign off of normalization. The point here being is the whole mood in Israel was the Palestinian cause is finished, it's dying, they can no longer mount any offensive, and all the focus now is on normalization with Saudi Arabia. And that's why I think they were taken by surprise. They were not expecting it.
The normalization, but just before we go there, you mentioned that Netanyahu was basically sleeping on the job, and that's the reason why this has happened. There's many people talking about the fact that maybe he wasn't sleeping on the job and that he deliberately allowed Hamas to do this. And to some extent, people from the Pakistan region or Pakistanis are referring to a May 9th type event, which happened in Pakistan, where it's alleged that people went, the army allowed people to do this because it suited their bigger purpose. Is there any sense in that argument for you?
I've heard this argument, and I know that it's quite popular in recent times on social media, but let's put some context in terms of what has unfolded before us. Biden has a presidential election coming up, and he is desperate for Saudi Arabia to sign this normalization deal with Israel. He's so desperate for normalization with Israel that he sent his CIA director, William Burns, to Libya 3 months ago to talk to the prime minister of Libya, which is in civil war, which is divided into two governments, to talk about the potential normalization of ties with Israel, suggesting it's so important that it comes before the priority of resolving the issues in Libya or the like. We also saw that the Israelis and Netanyahu has been touting normalization with Saudi Arabia as the deal of the century, as the greatest breakthrough since the Cold War. Both Netanyahu and Biden are fully aware that bin Salman cannot sign a normalization agreement in the midst of a war. He cannot sign a normalization in the midst of an escalation. It makes no sense for Biden or Netanyahu to start an escalation when bin Salman has already told them that I'm ready to set aside the Palestinian cause in order to sign the normalization. And it makes no sense for Biden and Netanyahu to start a conflict when Biden has already begun to cede to Saudi Arabia. Consider this, bin Salman wants a NATO-style security agreement. Biden has already begun discussing the draft to present to Congress and a backup plan in which if Congress doesn't approve, he will send the Fifth Fleet to the Saudi border to something that he doesn't need Congress else's permission for, to guarantee the security of Saudi Arabia. Bin Salman wants nuclear technology to build a weapon and to build nuclear facilities. The Reuters reports that the Israelis have allowed it, and Biden is already starting to provide that technology. In other words, Biden has gone out of his way to create an environment for Bin Salman to come out and sign the normalization agreement. I can't understand. It makes no sense for Netanyahu or Biden to essentially make this explode when Bin Salman is so open about the idea of normalization of ties. And now the opposite effect has happened. So as a result of this escalation, the Saudi statement that came out, and this is something for everybody to notice, in recent times under Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi statements have tended to omit the word occupier. They don't use the word colonizer anymore. They've been referring it to Israel, sometimes between quotation marks, but the change in language is reflective of bin Salman's move towards normalization. The statement from Saudi in response to these events in Palestine restores the word colonizer. He refers to Quwat al-Ihtilal. He refers to colonizers and occupiers, which shows that bin Salman is feeling the heat from public opinion and doesn't want to be caught on the wrong side of public opinion. If you are Netanyahu and Biden and bin Salman, whoever seen the Bloomberg interview of Netanyahu with Francine Lacroix says to him, what about the Palestinians? How will Saudi normalize without Palestinians? And he responds and says, Francine, the Saudis are not talking about Palestine in the way that you think they are. Like, it's not on the table. They're not asking us about Palestine. If Saudi, bin Salman is on the cusp of signing normalization, it makes no sense to start this false flag operation and essentially blow out of the water the potential of bin Salman to sign that normalization agreement. It's also worth noting that I get that people make the comparison with the May 9th events that took place in Pakistan as well. But I do think that with regards to Israel and Palestine, I think all the benefit was for Netanyahu to keep the peace as opposed to starting a conflict with Palestine.
But you mentioned the fact that this, to some extent, has blown the agenda and the timeline of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Of course, I'd like to hear more about that from you. How long do you think this is going to impact it? But does it make sense for Hamas to do this, therefore? That they were worried about the fact that the whole Middle East is turning away, they're turning towards getting on with life as normal, and therefore they decided to do this.
I think that's a very valid argument. What I will say is that it is true that the Palestinians have been very uncomfortable with the normalization agreements. And it is true that the Palestinians have been very let down by the Muslim nations and they feel let down by the international community. Having said that, the reason why I'm hesitant to tie this particular attack to normalization is for two reasons. The first is that for such a coordinated campaign to be organized in secret takes months of planning and months of organizations to avoid the detection of the Israelis. It's been 48 hours since the Palestinians launched their counteroffensive against the Israelis, and Israel still hasn't retaken the settlements that the Palestinians have taken back from the Israelis. In fact, if you look at a map, there is actually some reports that suggest that they are getting closer to the West Bank, suggesting that they might even be able to connect the West Bank to Gaza via a bridge, depending on the areas that they particularly take. That's the first point. The second point that is worth noting is that Hamas and the Palestinians generally, and everybody's focused on Hamas, but there's also conflict taking place in Ramallah, in the West Bank and the like. I think that Hamas doesn't need normalization as an excuse to go after the Israelis, nor have the Palestinians needed an excuse to go after the Israelis in the past. Every time the Palestinians build up new strength, they lash out against the Israelis to remind the Israelis that they cannot have an easy ride with regards to their occupation. And I think that one of the greatest victories of this particular offensive is to remind everybody that regardless of normalization, the Palestinians are still here, that they still have agency independent of the various different Arab regimes. There may well be a link, going back to your question, there may well be a link between the normalization with Saudi Arabia and this decision to attack Israel. But having said that, it may well be that this was planned well in advance, and this was the time they decided to launch it, at a time in which Israel believed that nothing would happen from the Palestinian front, and they are making a resounding statement of that we are here and we are capable and we're demanding even more concessions. And for those who think it's outrageous, the idea that Israel will give concessions, I refer them back to 1973, how when the Israelis pushed back the Egyptians and the Syrians, the reason Kissinger was so successful, Kissinger managed to get the Israelis to cede to the Egyptians and cede to the Syrians, to cede the territories that Israel had taken from them in exchange for facilitating normalization of ties between Egypt and Israel. The point here being is that the scale of this offensive that the Palestinians have embarked on has humiliated Israel to the extent that, given that Biden's priority is normalization, the Americans may go to the Israelis and say, look, you've retaken the settlements that the Palestinians took from you, but we want to facilitate normalization, give concessions to the Palestinians in order to facilitate that normalization. The scale of the attack is such that it may be Israel that provides the concessions, not the Palestinians.
Given the scale of the event, of the attacks that you've mentioned, already less than 48 hours, over 600 Israelis have been killed, around 400 Palestinians have been killed. We know thousands have been wounded on both sides. The event has been described as Israel's 9/11. And if we compare that to what America did after 9/11 and the attacks on the Middle Eastern countries, the chaos it caused in the Middle East, the attack on Afghanistan and Iraq as well afterwards, do you think Israel will respond in a similar fashion where the Americans, for example, said that we're going to bomb them back to the early history? I mean, do you see the Israelis doing that, attacking West Bank as well as Gaza?
I think that Netanyahu ideally would like to attack Gaza and the West Bank, but I will strike a difference between 9/11 and today's events. When 9/11 took place, it's important to remember what the regional landscape looked like at the time. The Saudi king Abdullah, he was crown prince at the time, but the de facto ruler, Abdullah had threatened 1 month before to cut ties with the Americans over the American response to the Intifada in Palestine. The Arabs were talking about breaking their relations with the US and moving elsewhere. There were bilateral agreements being scrapped and ripped up by the Saudis with the Americans. Essentially, there was a rebellion taking place in the Middle East. So when 9/11 took place, it was the perfect opportunity for America to go in and discipline the region, to wreak havoc and wreak force. And it worked because the Saudis were suddenly reeling. And people often talk about the Arab Peace Initiative. But I remember once, I know anecdotes are bad form, but I remember a majlis with Sheikh Abdulaziz al-Tuwaijiri, may Allah rest his soul. He was the chief advisor for King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, in which he narrated the story and said that the Arab peace plan came about in that the Saudis were so scared that the Americans would invade that when asked King Abdullah about the Arab peace plan, when the journalist asked King Abdullah about the peace plan, he said, write whatever you want, write what makes the Americans happy, just get them off my back. I think that this time it's different. The region is not in rebellion. The region is going towards normalization. America has no need to discipline the region. America now is scrambling to rescue an environment in which the Arab states were normalizing with Israel.
Do you think Israel has the need to discipline, though, in this particular case? After all, Israel has been psychologically hit. I mean, you mentioned it yourself that for the first time ever, Hamas has gone into Israel proper. Right? So there's been a psychological impact on both sides. And I want to hear the Palestinian impact as well. But Israelis have been psychologically disturbed by this particular impact. So do they need to discipline the Palestinians on this, and Hamas, obviously?
Netanyahu believes that the Palestinians need to be disciplined. He believes he needs to wreak havoc. He needs to pummel them. He needs to, in his words, cleanse the areas of the Palestinians and the like. And I think Netanyahu is sincere in his desire to do so. The problem for Netanyahu is that his telephone at the moment is ringing from the Egyptians, from the Qataris, from the Saudis, from the Americans, from the French, from the Europeans. Netanyahu, please don't punish these Israelis, because their Muslim brethren, their allies, are looking for normalization, and you will ruin it if you punish the Palestinians hard.
Do you think those calls are ringing, though? Because when you see the statements by the Western governments, they've given Israel carte blanche. They've said, go, you have full right to do self-defense, go and do what is necessary. And if you see Nikki Haley's statement, I've been shocked, as a presidential candidate, she said, bomb them, kill them with force.
I think certainly the statements are very bravado coming out. Biden said our support is rock solid. There's an American carrier that has been sent near Israel that is not designed to get involved in the fight. It's supposed to be a show of support for Israel. Certainly the presidential candidates are talking about bombing the Israelis and the like. But I do think that behind closed doors, I think there are intensive diplomatic efforts that are underway. I also think that when you look at the fact that a ground operation has not yet happened from the Israeli forces, something that's very unusual unusual. Usually they would be quite quick in launching a ground operation to punish the Palestinians. That suggests there's something up. Either the Israelis are too stunned, which I don't think they would still be stunned 24 hours into the conflict, or there is a debate taking place in the Israelis. Should we go for a ground operation, or should we leave it to airstrikes and the like? The Israelis sent a map out to the Palestinians to say, we're preparing for a ground operation, get out of these territories. But it's been many, many hours and there is no sign yet of this ground operation, suggesting not necessarily that the Israelis have been convinced not to do the ground operation, but that there is a debate taking place as to whether the Israelis should do a ground operation. I do think this is easy to understand from the American perspective. What does Biden want? Biden is under heavy pressure from the Republicans in these upcoming elections. Biden doesn't have a foreign policy achievement to show. Biden doesn't want to enter an election while Palestine and Israel is at war, and the Republicans can accuse him of not doing enough to stand by with our ally. Biden wants a de-escalation quickly, and Biden wants normalization quickly. And I think this is where the dispute now is taking place between Israelis and the Americans behind closed doors. Biden is talking about rock solid support while privately lobbying the Israelis to tell them, please don't ruin it for the Saudis. And I think today there was a phone call between Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and the UAE as well. And one thing about the UAE that's interesting is this: the UAE is the loudest advocate for normalization, and its statement is neutral. But UAE commentators, in an unusual move, are very openly backing the Palestinians, suggesting UAE has lifted the ban or lifted the repression of pro-Palestinian views in the UAE, suggesting that the UAE itself is feeling the discomfort, which means that when Blinken is talking to the UAE foreign minister, the UAE are not telling him, let the Israelis do what they want. The UAE are telling him, look, this is hard for us. You are putting us in a very difficult situation. Blinken, we gave you the prize. We gave you normalization. Bin Salman wants to normalize. Solve this crisis quickly, or we may have to think about revising our own position. So when you look at it from the American perspective, everything suggests they want Israel not to do a ground offensive. This doesn't mean Israel won't do one. My point is that at this moment, there's a debate taking place in Tel Aviv and Washington. Should we allow the ground offensive, or should we de-escalate quickly to allow further normalization to take place? And I don't think that debate has been settled yet.
Do you think the debate will be influenced with how many people come out onto the Arab streets? We've seen that in Yemen, for example, thousands of protesters have come out in support of the Palestinians. We haven't seen it on many other Arab countries so far. Do you think it will be determined by the number of people who come out and show an interest in this?
I think it will be determined less by the Arab streets, where everybody knows that they support the Palestinians and everybody knows the public opinion is there. I think it will be decided more based on the casualties that Israel suffers. The Israelis are not used to suffering casualties. They're not used to suffering casualties on this scale or on this level. And if they go into a ground operation, judging from previous ground operations and previous wars, the Israeli death toll tends to rise quite quickly. And what we see from the Israelis is initial support for the ground offensive, and then shock and horror that they're not achieving the objectives that they intended to achieve. And people remember 2008 when Netanyahu went to war with Hezbollah, threatening to remove them, and ended up after 1 week suddenly withdrawing and saying, you know what, I'm paying too high a price. Too many Israelis are dying in this war with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah has nothing to lose. They go all out, while I look foolish in front of my people for not being able to deal with them. And it was a humiliating setback for Netanyahu. I think the rising Israeli death toll, not that I encourage deaths or the like, but the rising Israeli death toll will increase the stakes and the price that Netanyahu will pay if he continues to go after the Palestinians. To put this into context, I think the Palestinians are ready to talk about concessions because they believe they achieved as much as they can. They've shocked the Israelis. They've delivered the greatest defeat since 1973. They've reminded the world that they're still there. They reminded them of their agency. They've proved that public opinion is with them, that they have the sympathies. Palestinians have nothing else to prove. They're ready to sit down and talk. The problem is now for the Israelis, who believe that if I go in and fight, the death toll will rise. Already the death toll, the more people have died in the last 6 days than the last 20 years of conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians? Do I risk further casualties and showing the Israelis that in a full-on fight, I can't eradicate the Palestinians in the way that I've led them to believe I can? Or do I cut my losses? I do a few more airstrikes, I pummel the buildings, I destroy the buildings, I rack up some more casualties for the Gazans, and then I go and sit at the table and try to make some sort of PR campaign where it says that I win. I think that people should not underestimate how damaging it is for Netanyahu, the rising casualties, and the more that number rises, it will get to a point where Netanyahu no longer thinks about ground operation, but looks about how to stem that rising humiliation that the Palestinians have inflicted.
Do you think, finally, I mean, do you think this will mean that Netanyahu might have to resign very soon?
I think that certainly the debate within the Israelis or amongst the Israeli journalists online is that this is the greatest failure since 1973 when the Israelis were taken by surprise. Netanyahu built his whole campaign, his election campaign and his government on the idea that we are the government of security. We are the ones who can protect Israel. But under his watch, Israel has seen the greatest threat to its security, possibly since 1973 or even since its inception. So the idea of Netanyahu being the government of security no longer stands. I think that Netanyahu will not be forced to resign yet. I think that a lot of the parties are offering to go into a coalition government with him, but them entering into a coalition government with him will weaken Netanyahu himself as he's forced to concede and give concessions to parties that he does not want to give. Whether Netanyahu will resign or not, I'm not entirely sure, to be quite frank or to be perfectly honest. Primarily because I think Netanyahu has a propensity to hold on. He's shown in the past that he's very capable of holding on, even in the face of what the Israelis would consider a defeat. And also, I think that if there's going to be any de-escalation or treaty, it will have to be done in a way, according to the Americans, a way in which Netanyahu can save face. And I think that's why it may well be that Netanyahu will escalate over the next few days and then try to de-escalate as the Americans come to something.
There's also a message that will go to Israeli democracy, that since we were busy fighting each other internally, and we know the huge amount of issues were happening within Israeli politics itself, regarding, for example, Netanyahu's actions that he was taking on the judiciary. The reservists had all said, we're not going to go and join the army, we're not going to be active. Do you think the message will go out that we were so busy destroying ourselves internally that this is why this has happened to us, and therefore weaken Israeli democracy?
I think that I think there has been a suggestion that this attack will unify the Israeli ranks or unify the Israeli parties. But when you look at the debate taking place between Israeli journalists, even online, even on Twitter or X as it's called, or even on social media or the like, the reality is that they are completely in disarray and they are not sure who to blame. Haaretz is blaming Netanyahu, Netanyahu is blaming the intelligence is blaming the military and the like. I think that the shock factor of this offensive means that Israelis are unlikely to be unified behind any particular principle or any particular front. And I actually think this will deepen the divide between the Israeli parties, particularly amongst those factions that want to see Netanyahu go. And I think that as a result of this particular shock, I think there will be a new debate in Israel as to, given that we were taken by surprise, what went wrong and how can we go forward? We were told normalization will ease the security threat, but we've normalized and we got the worst security threat since even before normalization was taking place. I think there will be a very deep debate, and I think it will continue to drive those divisions between the various different factions, which will result in greater confrontation, I think, between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Confrontation is often the means that Israel uses to hide the domestic political problems or the like. But I will say this, I think that the capabilities of the Palestinians it's clear that it's unprecedented, that every year they seem to get more missiles, more advanced weaponry, more advanced strategy, more advanced tactics. And I actually think that it shows that as the Palestinians are getting stronger, the Israelis are getting weaker. And I think the trajectory does suggest that the momentum is in favor of the Palestinians, even if the Israelis perhaps feel like they are still in a strong position. So to answer your question directly, I think it will weaken Israeli democracy. I think it will fuel authoritarianism, and it will fuel this debate as to how do we handle this existential crisis. And I don't think they will come to a conclusion that unifies the Israeli factions into something deeper. And I think the momentum is all in favor of the Palestinians.
Sami, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you very much, Najma, for having me.